All right, ladies and gentlemen, recently we talked about trying to figure out which instructional model is best when it comes to working with our students. And the conclusion that we came to is there is no one approach that is actually best in every single context. We want to look at the needs of our students, our learning goals, and then determine which of these instructional models is the best fit. So for example, if the skills, the knowledge pieces are new and foundational, we might lean towards a direct instruction approach. However, if students have a knowledge understanding of both the skills as well as the concepts, we might lean over towards more of the student-centered side or even the student-driven side. And knowing which instructional approach to use is really important when we get to this third step where we begin to plan learning experiences and instruction. You see, in part one of our midterm, we worked to identify the desired results. We looked at a content standard and worked to develop the big ideas and skills. And we did this by developing a learning objective as well as essential questions. Then in part two of the midterm, we worked to determine acceptable levels of evidence. We thought through formative as well as summative assessment that could be administered to students in order for us to better determine how they are doing in their progress towards learning goals. So now for this third part of the midterm, we are going to work to develop an actual lesson plan. We want to plan the learning experiences and instruction. So here is the third part of our midterm, this lesson plan template that deals with planning for student needs, as well as putting together the teaching learning strategies that we'll use, an instructional timeline, as well as materials and use of technology. But let's start at the beginning. It says before we begin, we need to go to File, make a copy, and then rename this document with our first and last name, as well as the title Midterm Lesson Plan. Then, as we complete each of the components below, we want to do so in the assigned color. So you might notice in Part A, there's green for when we talk about the class-wide needs, there's yellow for when we address the needs of English language learners, red for students with special needs. We want to use the assigned colors to make sure that we are doing all of the elements of the lesson plan that are required. Also, if you create or need to link to something, don't forget to do so as part of this assignment. Instructions for doing this about how to locate and upload a shareable link can be found right here on your template. So now let's get an overview of our class and students by clicking here for secondary education majors and here for elementary education majors. And what we're doing is taking a very close look both at the class in general as well as individual students that typically require a little bit more support. So we read once again through our class description and then through each of the students, looking at their strengths, their areas of concern, and what typically works out well for them. This information comes in really handy when we go to complete this part right here, Part 3A, Planning for Student Needs. You'll notice that this is going to be filled out based on the class descriptions, here or here, depending on the age group you're working with, and student profiles that are provided by your instructor. Now, when we look at this first part right here, it says to use the description of the class and students provided by your instructor to identify and describe any unique characteristics or needs of students in the class. We start by noting any necessary class-wide needs in green. So if we go up to our class description up here, we can see that at the very top there's a description of the class. We would read through this carefully and then summarize the overall needs of our class in a few sentences. Next, we would go through and identify any specific needs of our English language learners as well as our students with special needs. Just like we did before, we're going to go back to the description of our individual students, read through each one carefully, and then in a few sentences, summarize the needs based on the description that's here, as well as any strategies identified that we should keep in mind as we design a lesson. If the student we are describing is an English language learner, we should do it in this color font. And if the student is identified as having special needs, it should be in this color. Now let's say that one of the students on our list is not an English language learner, nor is he or she identified as having special needs. For example, let's look at John, a secondary student diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As we look through here, we don't see any clear indication that he is either an English language learner or a student receiving special education services. So what color would we put his information in? Feel free to select any other color that hasn't been used yet. So for example, when it comes to John, we might select a color that has not been used yet to identify and describe his needs. So if you'd like to see an example of what this might look like, you can go up to the top of Midterm Part 3, and underneath Step 4 it says there's an exemplar or sample lesson plan that can be found. If you click there, it opens up an example from a past student who fulfilled the requirements for this assignment. And you see underneath here we've got, okay, based on the information provided by the instructor, then the information that's general about the class is in green. Then, as far as English language learners, this color has been selected, and then it says, hey, I have 2 students who are English language learners, Paulo and Jesula. Paulo's first language is Portuguese, and it goes on to talk about his specific needs as well as accommodations that tend to work well in the past. Then I talk about my other English language learner, Jesula, her needs as well as what typically works for her. And notice we're not talking about all of our English language learners as if they're the same. We're also not talking about our students who are being served through special education services the same. We talk about them as individuals. So you can see that when it comes to students with special education needs, this teacher addresses their student Kelvin, who is another student in my class who requires extra attention. He receives special education services for a specific learning disability in reading, goes on, talks about his needs. But notice we're just in the color that's been assigned to English language learners or for students with special needs. We're simply summarizing the information that we can find in the class description or student description that was provided by the instructor, either for secondary or for elementary. Now, in this example or exemplar, you can see that only 3 students are talked about, and that's because it's just an example for you to see about how much to write and what it might look like. After providing a general description of the class needs, the needs of English language learners, special education students, and any other students, what you do is you create a table that looks just like this. Your table should have 3 columns, one that says student, one that says anticipated struggle during this lesson, and then accommodations/supports. To start off with, I would just list every student that is on the list provided by the instructor in their own separate line right here. And then as we go on and develop the rest of this lesson plan, we will be able to come back and identify, what is the anticipated struggle that we see Paulo, for example, having in this particular lesson. So without developing the lesson, we really can't fill in this part right here for any of our students. Also, we can't really nail down the specific accommodation or support that might be needed without having the specifics of the lesson. So again, for now, just create a table that has these labels at the top and then has a space for each one of your 6 students or so that are listed on the materials provided by the instructor. And then we'll come back to filling in these columns in a little bit. Okay, for the next part, we want to look at this. What do our students already know and understand in relation to what is going to be taught? As well as what misconceptions are they likely to have in relation to the vocabulary, concepts, skills, and/or topic? Now, the way I would start is I would take the content standard that I've been using for part 1 of this midterm, part 2 of this midterm, and then I would copy and paste it about right here. So in this case, this student has said, these are the standards or objectives that I'm going to be working with in this lesson. Copied and pasted. There's no need to really unpack any of these because what we're going to do is say, okay, we know that this standard or topic has probably been talked about in a prior year. So then we go back to the same content standard document that we got this standard from, and then we find the year before and say, okay, what have the students already covered that's just like this? So this is what this teacher is doing in his or her lesson. This is the standard that would have been covered the year before that's very similar to it. And so we copy the one from last year and put it just above it. Now we can see what students already know and understand. This is from the past year, the standard that was dealt with. And then we have this year. This is the standard that will be dealt with in this lesson. Now, you'll notice that there is a little bit underlined in the standard from last year, as well as the standard that's going to be a part of this lesson. And what you need to underline is what is different between the standard last year and the standard this year. That's important to keep in mind because often as teachers, if we're not careful, we can teach a standard in a way or at a difficulty level that's already been taught. So we want to make sure that we are addressing a topic, a skill, in the way that's articulated for the standard in our specific grade level. So there you have it. Last year's standard, and then this year's standard that we're dealing with. In addition, you need to provide context for your lesson. Now, in this assignment, your lesson might be taking place in the middle of the year, towards the beginning or the end. So I need you to explain to me, in the days leading up to the lesson that you're designing, what would have happened in those days? Would students have studied this, worked on this? You're providing some general context to show me that you know what would have led up to this lesson. You don't have to write too much, just enough to show me the context for your lesson, or what would have led up the days prior to your lesson. Then, in a different color, in this case blue, we need to identify what are the misconceptions that are likely held by our students regarding vocabulary, concepts, skills, and the topic that we're teaching. So this lesson involves the end of World War II, as well as the lead-in to the Cold War, and the relationship that exists between the United States and other countries when it comes to having and managing nuclear weapons. So this teacher has gone through and already said, okay, misconceptions. What are some things that our students probably don't know correctly or have learned wrong to this point? And here you can see that this teacher has identified that students are likely to use the terms nuclear, hydrogen, and atomic bombs incorrectly and even interchangeably. This teacher also anticipates that students will have misconceptions about our international relationship with the Soviet Union, USSR, back during the Cold War, especially compared to our current international relationship with Russia, same country, different name, considering they're from different time periods and the name of the country is different. What's really interesting is this teacher has identified that, when it comes to the topic of nuclear weapons and our international relationship with other countries, students are likely to have varied knowledge, prejudices, and bias concerning the nations that we'll talk about in our lesson and as part of our higher level thinking task when we introduce China, North Korea. So this teacher is already saying, look, I need to anticipate my students having varied knowledge, prejudices, and biases concerning China and North Korea. Your goal is to do the same, to anticipate and to describe the misconceptions likely held by your students regarding the vocabulary, concepts, skills, and topic that you will be teaching in your lesson. So now let's go down to the bottom part of Midterm Part 3, which says Part 3B, Teaching and Learning Strategies, Instructional Timeline, as well as Materials and Use of Technology. So a good way to start is to focus on this middle column, where you identify what teaching and learning strategies will be utilized by you, the teacher, and how you will use them to help facilitate learning. One way to do this is to take another look at your learning goal and content standard, and then look at the different instructional models that have been presented as part of class. And then you look at your learning goal, look at the instructional models. Your learning goal, look at the instructional models. And then decide which is the best fit based on the descriptions and examples provided by your instructor. So let's say in this case, I look at my learning objective as well as my content standard and decide that guided discovery learning is the best fit for how to go about teaching my students. I can go to the handouts provided by the instructor and then click on that first bullet that shows the different steps or components to that instructional model. Since there are 7 steps or elements to guided discovery instruction, what I could do is just copy all of these and then paste those into my midterm as placeholders for the different things that I need to make sure that I do with my students. First part, make sure that a relevant problem is introduced. Second part, that students each try to think of a solution to the relevant problem, and so on and so on. I can put these in as place markers to make sure that I am incorporating all the elements of the model that I feel is the best fit for my learning goal and for my students. So if you go back to the example that was provided up here, we can see that this example seems to follow a direct instruction model. We see the pieces such as engagement hook, then we have presentation of new content or skills using a variety of modes. This student has taken each of the elements of direct instruction and then described in detail what he or she will be doing. So for example, engagement hook. The teacher's going to have an anticipatory set, some questions, some discussions, but it's very scripted as far as what those questions will be, what the teacher will do to help facilitate discussion with the students, In other words, the amount of detail needs to be so that it's pretty scripted, to the point that a substitute teacher or somebody else could pick up the lesson plan and follow it with success. You'll also notice that after each part of your lesson, you need to identify about how much time it'll take. And in total, all of your estimated time needs to add up to 60 minutes of instruction. So here you can see that this teacher supposes that this will take about 2 to 5 minutes. Well, as an instructor, I would look and say, okay, 5 minutes here, says 2 to 3 minutes there. I'm going to round up 3 minutes there, 5 minutes there. And when I add up all these minutes, the highest part of the estimate, it should add up to 60 minutes total of instruction. In addition, it's very helpful to always look for these little pop-ups from the rubric. Reminder from the rubric, reminder from the rubric. Because as you look at the rubric, you can see any other elements that you might need to include. You might, for example, see that on the rubric it says you'll be evaluated based on interdisciplinary connections that are clearly established. So what you could do is copy and paste that label, put it into your lesson plan where it actually comes up to make sure that whoever's evaluating your lesson plan can tell that you are using all of the steps of the model you've selected, and in addition, anything else from the rubric that needs to be included. So again, use all of the elements from the model that you select. Remember, you're only selecting one of the 3 models. Then check the rubric to see if there are any other elements that need to be incorporated into that column of the lesson plan. You'll also see that in the first column, we need to list what students will be doing. So here we have the teacher part, for example. The teacher says that what I will do is provide an engagement hook, anticipatory set, some questioning, discussions, and essential questions. Here we have the specific questions outlined, as well as students' opportunity to partner up. But this is what the teacher will be doing. Next to it, we need to identify what the students will be doing. In this case, the student says that his or her students will listen and then respond to the essential questions individually, then discuss in partners. Finally, students will record new insights gained from their discussion with their partner or other classmates. In other words, the middle column is what we would see if we watched the teacher, whereas the first column is what we would see if we were watching the students in action. You will also notice, though, in this first column, we can identify in what ways we will support and accommodate our students that we've listed up in the section above. So here we have Paulo, Jesula, Kelvin, and each of them actually has a need to have extra support when it comes to vocabulary. So if that's the case, on this side where it says what the students will do, I could describe what sort of support or accommodation those students would be receiving. In this case, I say that vocabulary will be pre-taught or provided to Paulo and Jesula during ELL support time. Kelvin will receive the same vocabulary support the day before the lesson during his after-school check-in that he typically has with the teacher. So every time we see a need for a support or an accommodation, we will address it with whatever student or students need it in this column right here. But it's not like we need to list all of the students provided every single time over here. This is only the students that need support in that particular moment of the lesson. For example, here you have a part where the teacher is presenting new content skills and using a variety of modes. Not all of the students will need extra support. However, Jesula and Kelvin will each be provided notes by the teacher that they can highlight and use for discussion of their peers, rather than create their own notes from scratch. Since only Jesula and Kelvin will require that, only they are listed in this part. Now, also keep in mind that you want to have all the materials prepared that you would actually use in this lesson. So if I say that I'm going to provide extra vocabulary support for Paulo, for Jesula and Kelvin, I need to actually create and attach a link to the vocabulary support sheet that I would use with those students. Likewise, if I'm going to use a short video as part of my engagement hook for the lesson, I'd need to find the exact video I'd use and insert a link to it there, as well as a brief description of how each resource will be used. You'll notice that you'll also have an opportunity to build in the resources that you've already developed. For example, the formative assessment that you've already designed in part 2 of this midterm would be part of this lesson. This also holds true for the deeper level thinking task or summative assessment, which is likely going to fall towards the end of the lesson, as you can see right here. In other words, use the resources you have already created and put them into this lesson plan, be it your learning goals or objectives, your essential questions, your formative assessment, as well as your deeper level thinking task. But you also need to design and attach a link to other resources. For example, this teacher plans on using some instructor slides to help present content, make discussion questions visible to the members of the class, as well as to provide some instructions. Whatever you decide to use, be it slides on something like Google Slides, or documents or handouts for your students, make sure that you create and insert a link to on this side that says materials and/or use of technology. So now that we have this pretty well developed, what we will be doing, carefully scripted out, what students will be doing and how we will support them, as well as links and descriptions of the materials and technology we'll be using as part of the lesson. Then we can go back up and fill in the rest of the chart in this part right here, Part A. Remember that we only listed our students here as well as these categories across the top. Now that our lesson is more developed, we can identify where in the lesson each of our students is likely to struggle and what they're likely to struggle with. We can also include whatever supports and accommodations we can and will be providing to our students. In other words, the same information that we identified in this column right here, which students need accommodations or support, when and how we will do so, this information will also appear up in this part of the chart. So in summary, let's make sure that we complete each of the components of the lesson plan in the assigned color. Make sure that any extra resources or materials you create have been linked to in your lesson. Also, design your lesson with the needs of your class and your students in mind. But if you feel like you're getting stuck and don't know exactly what's expected, feel free to click on the exemplar or sample lesson plan right here.